Hey everybody, welcome to another fun-filled moment of history and learning. This week we have a lot of information that we are going to have to cover. We have to cover a great deal of ground, and that is going to start with looking at the American Revolution. Now you'll recall from last week we talked about a number of the different causes for the American Revolution. Some of those, of course, included the taxes which were imposed by the British against the English colonials. We'll now just refer to them as Americans. But the reality is that the central cause for the war was not the taxes themselves, but rather it was the lack of representation that the Americans felt that they did not have in the English Parliament. Right? We have to remember within the broader context that we've got the Enlightenment going on. We've got John Locke's ideas beginning to float around. The ideas that the government was created by the people, for the people, to protect their liberties. And now all of a sudden what you have is this very strong central government imposing its will upon people who don't believe they have any say in the matter. And so what that's going to do is it's going to gradually push the, the colonials, the Americans, towards a state of rebellion. Now, the American Revolution actually begins in 1775. It actually predates the Declaration of Independence. And in fact, as early as January of 1775, there's still a number of folks within the colonies who are not sure whether or not they want to declare independence or whether or not they want to reconcile with Mother England. But in that year, in the early year of 1776, Thomas Paine is going to publish a pamphlet known as Common Sense. And basically what Paine is going to argue here is that it is common sense for the Americans to distance themselves and in fact break away from monarchy. He gives a number of different reasons for this, making arguments such as England only protects us from her enemies, not from our enemies. This is his verbiage. We will still be able to trade our goods at market as long as people in Europe are still willing to purchase those things to eat. In other words, he's basically saying we can thrive as a nation without Great Britain. And this really helps to expedite a process that I think would have happened anyways, but it helps to expedite us declaring our independence, which we do, of course, on the 4th of July, 1776. Thomas Jefferson, of course, writes that Declaration of Independence. But what the Declaration of Independence does, and it does a lot of different things, but for the purposes of this mini lecture, the thing that the Declaration of Independence does is it gives purpose to the fighting that was already going on, right? The shot heard round the world that started the revolution was shot at Lexington. There was the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And in fact, just as a side note, by the time that we declared our independence, we had already fought the battles of Lexington and Concord. We'd already fought the battle of Bunker Hill. More traditionally, it took place on Breed's Hill, but nonetheless. And the British had already landed thousands of men at Staten Island. So by the time that we declared independence, fighting's already happening. And so what the Declaration does is it gives purpose. We are no longer fighting for reconciliation, but rather we're going to fight for independence. Now, we could get bogged down into all the different campaigns of the American Revolution. We could talk about General George Washington and his strategy. One of his main strategies of the war was simply to outlast the British. And part of the reason why he develops this strategy is out of necessity. He does not have a navy. He does not have the most well-trained army in the world, right? If you study Valley Forge at any point in your life, you'll know that Washington had to spend a lot of time at Valley Forge just training and equipping his men to do much of anything. And so Washington decides, of course, we just have to outlast the British. There are some key moments in the American Revolution, right? You got this famed Battle of Trenton, Battle of New Jersey, you've got the Battle of Boston, you've got 1777, the battles of Saratoga. Those are actually really important because following the battles of Saratoga, you get the alliance with the French, and they have a navy, and in fact, it's their navy that allows for us to be successful in 1781 at the Battle of Yorktown, which ultimately will bring an end to the war. The war comes to an official end in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. But I don't want to get bogged down in all of the strategies and campaigns, but I do think it's important to think about this one question. How revolutionary was the American Revolution? I mean, on one hand, you could say that it's definitely a revolutionary historical moment with respects to the political revolution that went on, right? We went from monarchy and ultimately we created a republic. And when we talk about the Constitution, we'll note that that's exactly what the founding fathers created, was a republic. And so in that regard, it is revolutionary. The way in which these radical men were thinking was that the government itself should change, it should shift. But from another point of view, the American Revolution doesn't seem so revolutionary. And when we think about it from a social point of view, that is, to what degree did the revolution change the position of people within society, it tends to be a little bit less revolutionary. I mean, in one regard, as John Green of Crash Course History would say, you went from a bunch of white men running the show to a bunch of white men running the show. The position of slaves in the United States didn't change that much, right? Granted, many within the North did abolish slavery. Slavery did exist in the northern states, but it is abolished in the North. But that doesn't mean that African Americans now occupied a social position of equality with white people. That's not the case. Obviously, slavery is not extended or is not abolished in the South. Native Americans are not treated any better. Women, for the most part, their position in society isn't much better. There is this movement within society to extend women's education. It comes under this idea of Republican motherhood. And Republican motherhood basically means that women were seen as kind of the purveyors of morality, and therefore, because they would instill in their sons moral virtue and ideas and knowledge, that these women should therefore have a more robust education. But we have to understand that Republican motherhood meant this: we need to educate women so that they can make their sons better. The idea here is that we extend education for women, but not for their own benefit, but for the benefit of their male children. And so from a social point of view, really the American Revolution isn't very revolutionary, right? It's not a historical revolutionary moment. We might say, however, that it was a revolutionary process because, of course, over the period of history, women and African Americans and others have gained a position of social equality, more so than they had, obviously, 200 years ago. But the revolution comes to an end, 1783, the Treaty of Paris, and we have a country. And it's now time for the United States to create something for itself. It needs a kind of government. And what's interesting is that the Congress that was in existence during the American Revolution had a form of government that they had adopted. They will adopt this form of government in 1781. It was initially drafted in 1776, but it took a few years for the government to adopt this particular constitution. And the name of that constitution is the Articles of Confederation. When we get into the Articles of Confederation in our reading, in our films, you're going to become aware of the fact that the Articles of Confederation were very, very weak. And this was done very deliberately. The folks who wrote the Articles of Confederation, they did not want to create a very strong centralized government. They were at war with a very strong centralized government, and they didn't want to recreate that within the United States. And so they created the Articles of Confederation. And understand that the Articles of Confederation is just that. It's a confederation. It's not really a union. The way I talk about this is that when we think about these words confederation and union, we can sort of think of it like this. A confederation is you have all these different people, all these different colonies, all these different states, and they have a few common interests with one another. And so they come together and they join what they called a league of friendship. And so they recognize that they have some common interests that intersect here and here and here, so they're going to play with one another a little bit, but for the most part, they're still independent. A union, particularly the way we think of the United States after the Civil War, is more like this. It's interlocked. Right? Our interests are one and the same. So when we think about the states that existed under the Articles of Confederation, it's really best to think of them as 13 separate states, 13 separate little countries, if you want, that have some common interests, right? That's going to change over the history. But the problem with the Articles of Confederation is this. Because all the power was founded in the states, The government that was created under the Articles could not force the states to do anything. In fact, the Articles of Confederation did not create an executive branch, did not create a judiciary. Laws could be made, but they couldn't be enforced. Taxes could not be demanded from the states. If you wanted to make changes to the Articles of Confederation, you had to have a unanimous decision by all of the states. Ultimately, nothing could get done. And the big thing that needed to get done during the immediate aftermath of the war was to pay off taxes. And there was lots of taxes that had to be paid, taxes that had to be paid back to other countries, taxes that needed to be paid back to certain banks. And ultimately, it's going to result in a series of rebellions. Perhaps the rebellion that's most noted and looked at is Shays' Rebellion, Daniel Shays' Rebellion, a farmer out of Massachusetts. And ultimately what you find is that in these rebellions, you see the weaknesses of the Articles, because if the federal government was stronger, it could do things that would keep people like Daniel Shays from rising up. Now, I will say this. There were a lot of folks within the United States, people like Alexander Hamilton, for example, who looked at these rebellions and they saw a lot of problems. One of the things we need to be aware of is that there was a lot of class consciousness going on in the United States at this point in time, and people like Alexander Hamilton and others would look at someone like Daniel Shays, who occupied a social position here, and they would say, Hamilton would say, if Daniel Shays can rebel and revolt, then what he's going to do is chisel away at the social distance between the two of them, and ultimately they would become socially equal. And so part of the reason for getting rid of the Articles of Confederation had to do with the fact that they were weak, but it also had to do with the fact that there were some folks who believed that there was too much democracy going on. There was too much mob rule going on, and we needed to put a stop in that. And so ultimately what comes about is the Constitutional Convention. It's held in Philadelphia in 1787. Ultimately, a constitution will be created. It is the Constitution that we currently live under. In fact, the Constitution that we have right now is the longest lasting constitution in human history. It's been amended 27 times, okay? And we're going to, again, get into the Constitutional Convention, but there was a lot of questions about what this new government should look like. And ultimately, the Founding Fathers, again, all of them white, all of them men, the majority, or a good many of them, were slaveholders. So you're going to have to understand that many of the compromises that were made in the Constitution were made in order to placate, pacify Southern slaveholders. For example, the 3/5 Compromise, which said that when we count people in the states in order to figure out how many representatives they should get in the Congress, we're only going to count 3/5 of the total number of slaves, which means that the other group would not be considered human beings, right? And this reinforces this idea of chattel slavery, that slaves are no better than your pigs or your cattle. Deeply troubling, but that becomes part of the Constitution itself. But there are a number of compromises that are made. Ultimately, in the end, what we create is a government where we have separation of powers. We break our government up into three branches. The executive branch, which is the presidency, that in the Constitution is outlined in Article 2. You have the legislative branch, which is the Congress. And the Congress is broken up into two houses. That would be the Senate and the House of Representatives. That is talked about in Article 1 of the Constitution. And then finally, you have the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court, and that's talked about in Article 3. In total, there are 7 articles in the Constitution. They all talk about different things: how to impeach a president, how to ratify the Constitution, how to amend the Constitution, a whole range of different things. And there's some really important aspects to the Constitution that if we had more time I could get into. Particularly, I think you should be aware of something called the Necessary and Proper Clause, also referred to as the Elastic Clause. Some people look at the Constitution as a living, breathing document. It's a document that can change as the times change. Others would argue that the Constitution says what it says, and that's the only thing that the government is free to do. We refer to this as strict constructionism or loose constructionism. But nonetheless, the Constitution is signed and written in 1787. According to the Constitution, 9 out of the 13 states had to ratify or give the thumbs up for the Constitution to become law. It wasn't until 1788 that that actually took place. The 9th state finally approved it in 1788. Following the ninth state, Virginia and New York would then come in as number 10 and 11 respectively. And by 1789, every single state had in fact ratified the Constitution, and it became law. Now, of course, once the Constitution is passed, we have to elect ourselves presidents and create a bureaucracy and all that fun stuff. And so, we get our first president, George Washington. And in fact, he's elected unanimously 2 times. He gets every single vote. And there are multiple things that occurred during Washington's presidency. There's many things that occurred during John Adams's presidency. He comes after Washington. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, okay? I don't have time to get into all the details of each of their presidencies. There's key events that occur in every one of them. For example, during Washington's and John Adams's administrations, you begin to see the formation of political parties. Jefferson would represent one end of that political spectrum, calling themselves Republicans, although not the current Republican Party. Historians simply call them Jeffersonians. And on the other hand, you have people like Alexander Hamilton, who was creating the Federalist Party. The Federalist Party tended to be more British, pro-British. They wanted a stronger central government, while the Jeffersonians wanted smaller government, and they tended to be pro-French. During Thomas Jefferson's administration as president, he purchases the Louisiana Territory for $15 million in 1803, which contributes to westward expansion and manifests destiny. We'll talk about that at a later time. But one of the things that seems to be a trend through every single one of the very first presidents is that there were foreign policy problems going on, predominantly between the French and the British. War will erupt between the French and the British. The French Revolution erupts during George Washington's administration, and the French basically come knocking on the door and say, hey, United States, remember when we helped you out in the American Revolution? Now we're fighting other folks, we're fighting the British, we want you to help us out. Long story short, in the end, George Washington says, nope, we're not going to do that. Rather, we're going to be neutral. And in fact, Washington issues something called the Neutrality Proclamation, where he says, we will be friendly towards all the belligerent powers. That means if you guys want to go and kill each other, you go right ahead. But we're also going to be impartial. That means we're not going to throw aid on one side and not the other. So basically, we're gonna keep our hands in the air, but we're also going to be doing like this. Why? Because we want to continue our trade with both of these countries. And one of the things that you're going to find throughout Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and James Madison's presidencies is that these tensions between France and England grow so deep that eventually they begin to interfere with American shipping. The British begin a process of impressing American ships, that is, taking ships. They were seizing sailors off of these ships. And this was causing a lot of problems for the United States because we were an independent nation. You can't just capture our ships just because you don't want us trading with France because it might help them win the war. And the French were doing similar things to us in order to keep the British from winning the war. We also had some issues with the British because we were under the impression that the British were inciting Native Americans to rebel against the United States. And the British also had access to Canada, and the United States was thinking maybe we might like to have portions of Canada. Long story short, by 1812, all of these tensions blow over. We declare war against Great Britain. This will be referred to as the War of 1812. And technically, the United States wins the War of 1812. I would really say that the United States lasts through the War of 1812. I mean, during the war, particularly in 1814, the war went really, really south for the United States. I mean, the British burned down the Capitol in 1812. It was only through a storm that came in that ultimately that was put out. But one of the things that's interesting about the War of 1812 is that the War of 1812 provides for the United States a sense of identity. It provides for the United States a sense of itself, its spirit. You know, it's interesting that we started off this lecture with the American Revolution, which creates a country. But the War of 1812 really helps to create its identity. And one of the lasting monuments, if you will, of that war is the Star-Spangled Banner. Francis Scott Key, no relation. He is out on a ship watching a battle known as the Battle of Baltimore, and he is off looking at this particular conflict. And in the morning, after the gunsmoke is cleared, he sees the Star-Spangled Banner, which was a giant flag, still waving, and so he writes down the lyrics to the poem, that we now call the Star Spangled Banner, the national anthem. And so, in many ways, the War of 1812, although we didn't necessarily, kick butt and ask questions later, it helps to define the United States and provide for us a sense of who we are. There's some climactic key battles in the War of 1812. The Battle of Lake Erie, for example, major naval victory for the United States. You got the Battle of New Orleans, which technically happens after the war was over. The Treaty of Ghent had been signed around Christmas time, 1814, but we didn't get the memo, so we have this last final battle. But yeah, I know that's a lot of information, and I really just skipped over the surface of most of this. There's a lot more to say, and there's a lot more that I'd like to say, but I don't want to bog you down with a hour to 2 hour long video. Just wanted to give you a sense of what this content looks like. So if you'd like more information, I would love to meet with you in a Zoom meeting and we can talk more about this. If you want answers to questions like, can police officers search your phone and confiscate it without a warrant? Can they do the same thing with your car? Do you know what your Bill of Rights are, which, by the way, are the first 10 amendments to the Constitution? If you'd like to know what your liberties are, things like this, let me know, and we can set up a meeting. We can talk more about that. Otherwise, that brings us to an end for today. So, everybody, I hope you have a fantastic week, and I hope you enjoy this information. So, until next time, go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you, live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor.